So success is often about going from one failure to the next without losing your enthusiasm. Success isn't final, and failure isn't fatal. It's sort of the courage to continue is what it's about. Winston Churchill, or thereabouts, paraphrase such. And why those words are relevant, I think, is you heard in those words a certain spirit that we also heard in those voices on that video. And it's also true that it's hard to have the big success without having a lot of small failures. And we heard that on the video. I think Mark Catini said it best when he talked about that culture that started actually with the founders. And though there's a lot of things about that culture that changed over time, there was a root that never really did change, about a passion. Andy Dressel said, it was more than a job, it was a hobby. I would add, it was more than a hobby, it was our life. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how critical culture was in making MapInfo successful. The second thing was just say no to status quo. We never, ever felt like we were satisfied. And this goes back to the founders as well. We talked about managing chaos, surviving chaos. I would say they created chaos. And they did it purposefully because they were never satisfied with where the company was at, where the products were at. So always challenging yourself to do better. And the last thing is success has a method. There's not one method. But I would argue I'm not a big believer in accidental success. Can you have luck? Sure. But you better be well positioned to take advantage of that luck. One prime example is actually pivoting with a purpose. So I would say one of the things that we were able to do at MapInfo was we had a lot of strong business disciplines, and one of them was pivoting with a purpose. And what do I mean by that? Well, you make sure that you do the work up front so you understand the strategic direction, you understand the enablers, you understand the barriers, and you go forward with force and focus, and you make it work. And the reason that's different is because so often pivot can be misused as a word. And today I talk to a lot of entrepreneurs who are very anxious to pivot, almost too much so, because you lose your focus. And it's hard to succeed without that focus. So I'm talking about purposely pivoting around strategic intent and making sure you execute on it. I'm not talking about sort of the shiny object pivoting. That could be very detrimental to a company. MapInfo was very successful at doing pivoting with a purpose. I'm going to talk about this as sort of the framework for our conversation today. I've defined the top sort of the stages. This is not textbook stages. As I look back at MapInfo's journey, these are the stages that I sort of said, this talks about our journey in the most appropriate way. Also, there's some context on the leadership that has evolved through there. I'm flattered to be standing up here today, to be able to share the story with you, and I'm sure John would say the same thing. But it's really not one person's role to tell the story. That's why it was great having that video and having you hear all those other voices. And the story I'm going to weave today isn't just my version of it. I've had the conversations with Mark and with Mike Marvin and Brian Owen as well. And then I'm going to take us through 6 key pivots over a 20-year period that really help continue to set the company on its course. And the first one, I'm not sure I could say it much better than the founders already did, is that sort of early stage part. In that early stage, they're focusing on, you heard at one point, it was Andy that talked about chaos. And there was a lot of chaos going on at that stage of the company. Every day there's chaos. Trying to figure out where the next sale is going to be from, how you're going to get your employees. It was challenging to hire during that stage. What did you have to offer? How could you pay? Yet that's exactly what you needed, was critical employees to take it to the next level. So often you found friends. But then sometimes because they were friends, maybe they weren't the right hire, and how did you deal with it after that? That was certainly difficult for them to handle. There's a lot of untold stories about how they had to take a tent to pitch as opposed because they couldn't afford a hotel room. Or how the actual first sale wasn't software at all, it was actually candy, so they could actually get some revenue. So these are the little untold stories. Sean talked about wanting to make a difference and having an impact. And if you look back at MapInfo over the years, MapInfo was involved with many key police forces around the world and helping proactively eliminate crime. MapInfo was also involved in most of the recent Olympics over the last 20 years or so. And on a reactive fashion, MapInfo is in the middle of a lot of natural disasters. Not only our technology and helping to recover, but also our people there to help. And how many of you now do not have in your possession a cell phone that probably has some sort of mapping application on it? All right? That was the mission, to make mapping something that everybody could use. So they certainly did that. I think looking back at it, if we all sat in the room and say, during that stage, what's the one thing we really wish we could have a do-over on? And again, I should say, I was not in the room at that time. I joined the company in 1995, which was about a year and a half after it went public. All right? So as I'm talking about this stage, I'm talking about if we all sat down together and looked at it, I think it would be one thing major, which was how do we better protect our intellectual property? The company filed no patents. Now, who do you see playing in the mapping space today? Google, Microsoft, Oracle. It sure would have been nice if there was some patent protection on some of the technology in the early days. So as we go back and we look at some of those key pivots, and the first one happened right away. From in-car navigation to desktop mapping. Great decision to get out of that. In-car navigation was a market that took over 20 years to develop with significant investments during that 20 years. Where the founders of MapInfo were right away able to make progress and create a company and move forward with some exciting new technology. As the company started to ramp up and think about what they could be, they had to think about becoming public. And what Mike Marvin realized at that point in time and the team was they probably needed different leadership in doing that. So they had to go from an advisory board concept to a board that could be able to take the company public. They needed to change the leadership team. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of drama around all those incidents that we won't get into today, because this is supposed to be a happy story. But you can imagine those type of things that happen through that type of pain. As the company positioned for that, another thing was, how do they scale? So a small company, you only have a limited amount of employees, your products are needed around the world, you have cool technology, how do we scale? Well, back in the mid-1980s, that was all about establishing a network of partners. And so the company made a real strategic shift from direct selling to a value-added reseller model, which allowed the company really to be able to take off and go internationally. That's a big difference, and the reason it was a big difference was, like anything in life, you do something successful, it gets copied. I come up with a really cool vampire movie, right? Within the next 2 years, there's 10 vampire movies and books and TV shows, right? The world's about copycats. There's a company called Strategic Mapping, Inc. that came out and tried to replicate the MapInfo value proposition. MapInfo spent a significant amount of time in those early years fighting off that domestic competitor, probably with no profit coming from domestic operations, all the profit coming from its international arm. But because they had that, they were able to fight off that competitor, and that competitor eventually couldn't survive in the marketplace. Now I want to talk to the next one, which is the stage of relevancy. So what does that mean? Well, that certainly means that to go public, things are going to change. And that state of relevancy also meant now you had some pretty big brands as your customers. So the pragmatists were buying from you. It's no longer the early adapters. Those are big name brands at this point. And it's also, if you see a picture, every company has their secrets. And I'm letting you in one in today. You see a picture there of John Cavalier in his Superman outfit. And I bet you didn't know this. So John was a big fan of the Justice League. For those of you that are old enough, the Justice League is. So some days you'd come into work and he'd be in an Aquaman outfit. He'd come in another day and he'd be in a Batman outfit. But his favorite by far was Superman. Now I bet you didn't know that. Anybody know this? There's a reason you didn't know this. I just made it up. It's not true at all. Right, there is another story there, but I'll let John tell that someday. And to that point, that was my way of introducing John, because John served as CEO at MapInfo for about 3 years during this stage of the company. And so with that, I'd like to ask John to come up for a few minutes.